Now let me just spend a moment on why it is so important that we pass this bill. And of course at the top of the list is the need for fiscal sustainability across all our programs, something that those on the other side of the House seem to still be in denial about, to still ignore in their claim that every bit of spending should remain. There are two critical but distinct parts of the government's focus on fiscal sustainability. One, of course, is getting the budget back to surplus over the forward estimates, made more challenging by the serious economic headwinds we face, a fall-off in the terms of trade and mining investment, falling company tax revenues and the end of the consumption boom driving GST revenues, none of which those opposite seem to take into account in their thinking about how they would spend money if they were in government and how they spent money when they were in government. Secondly, but as importantly, we need to ensure that we have long-term sustainability in our budget. Long-term sustainability in our budget. The Parliamentary Budget Office tells us that under the last government, spending was rising at 3.8% a year. 3.8% a year, and yet we can expect revenue to only rise at something like 3%. Now, you don't have to be the world's greatest mathematician to work out that this is a serious problem. This is a fiscal cliff, and we are going over it, and if we don't deal with it, one of two things must happen. Either we have a massive tax hike. I don't say trivial, massive. Right now, we have tax at about 23% of GDP. If we were to allow this to continue, a simple two-line spreadsheet will tell you that within a short period of time, federal tax will have to rise to 30% of GDP. 30% of GDP. And go tell that to your employees, your constituents, your taxpayers. Those on the other side of the House seem to have no regard for the future taxpayers of this country. And of course, one of the great disappointments about the way the PBO works at the moment is it doesn't demand the opposition put its estimates, put its spending promises beyond the forward estimates out for scrutiny. And that is something that desperately needs to be changed. The spending promises of the last Labor government, and no doubt the opposition as we move towards the next election, beyond the forward estimates, are not subject to scrutiny and absolutely should be, because we need to make it clear, make it absolutely crystal clear which side of the parliament is ensuring that the future taxpayers don't have to wear the spending, the profligate spending of those on the other side of the House. Now, Deputy Speaker, to keep the FEG scheme viable, it's clear that we need to make changes. It's grown absolutely dramatically, with demand increasing from 8,626 claimants being paid $73 million in 2006-07, a very sustainable number, to 16,019 claimants being paid $262 million. $262 million. That's almost 3.5 times what it was 6 years earlier, in 2012-13. This increase is absolutely unsustainable and is exactly the sort of increase we see from those opposite in so many of the programs that they oversaw, and in this case they enshrined in legislation. So from a budgetary point of view, the current 4 weeks redundancy pay for each year is no longer sustainable, and setting the entitlements to 16 weeks in total is fiscally responsible. Now, it's important to note that, as I mentioned earlier, capping the redundancy payment will bring the FEG in line with Labor's National Employment Standards and the Fair Work Act of 2009. The current redundancy benefit under FEG provides 4 weeks' pay for every year of service, and we know that is well above the standards set in the National Employment Standards outlined in the Fair Work Act. In fact, Labor has told us that the National Employment Standards in that Act got the balance right and sets a community standard. Got the balance right and sets a community standard. And yet they're not prepared to support it in this legislation. The hypocrisy we see continually from those opposite is awe-inspiring. It's extraordinary, but it's not good enough. It's not good enough, and that's why we're proposing this change. Remembering that this is a scheme of last resort that should only cover redundancies that are in line with the community standard. Now, it should be noted that the scheme already has a cap on maximum wages of $127,000 per annum. So there are caps everywhere already in this scheme. And that reflects the intent of the scheme that more generous remuneration above community standards shouldn't be covered by a safety net scheme. Now, we've heard many in the community supporting this cap. The AIG said the 16 weeks cap mirrors the entitlement to redundancy under the National Employment Standards and hence reflects community standards. The Master Builders Association submitted similar things to the Senate inquiry on the issue and said that the general redundancy standard put in place by Labor was out of step with their general community standard and suggested that the proposed cap be brought in line with the community standard. Both AI Group and ACCI said that a publicly funded safety net scheme is necessary to protect workers whose employers went bankrupt, but they both stressed that it should offer an appropriate level of protection. Now, it's also important to note that this bill only impacts a small proportion of claimants. Turns out that historically, over a 3-year period, that's 6%. There were 41,393 claimants over the last 3 years for this scheme, and this change will only affect 2,446, so 6%. So the vast majority of claimants will be totally unaffected, and those claimants that were affected only by a relatively small amount in the vast majority of cases. As I said earlier, the bill only affects the redundancy entitlement, and all other entitlements are unchanged. It's important also to note that the bill removes a moral hazard, the sort of moral hazard that those opposite seem to like. The FEG as it stands create a moral hazard where unions, company directors, CEOs or business owners can inflate redundancy entitlements where companies are in trouble, and the taxpayer will pick up the tab when the companies go broke. It's not the sort of moral hazard that the Australian people would find acceptable. The AI Group discussed this fact and said that there are major moral hazards present in the current legislative provisions because there's little protection against employers being coalesced by unions into implementing extremely generous redundancy packages in the lead-up to insolvency, leaving taxpayers picking up the tab. And we heard similar comments coming from ACCI, who said, "What I am saying is that the potential arises in the dynamic it introduces into negotiations. It's one thing for two parties to sit down and negotiate terms and conditions, but if they know at the back of their mind that ultimately the government will pick up this entitlement, then our proposition is that it will impact on the bargaining between the two parties." Deputy Speaker, sustainability of well-directed and high-quality government programs is the focus of this government and should be the focus of future governments of Australia. And this bill is intended to do exactly that. This is an important program, and losing it and others like it because of unsustainable growth in spending is totally unacceptable. I commend this bill to the House.
Yeah.